Father John was our squadron chaplain. The first day of Desert Storm, as we headed out to the airplanes, after we walked out into that black I told you about, I got to my jet, and standing right in front of the nose of my jet is Father John. At first I thought he was a crew chief, so I got close enough to see who he was. Now, Father John was popular with us because Father John was the first guy to buy you a whiskey. He was the first guy to light up a cigar. He was the first guy to start the party, the last guy to leave. And he'd also been the first one, along with Father Pat, I suspect, of wading into hell in his BVDs to pull you out if he had to. We knew Father John real well. He fit in great with the fighter squadron. But as I got to the airplane, Father John just said, "Hey, I thought you might like a blessing before you go." And I immediately hated myself because I consider myself fairly comfortable in my religion, and I'd never thought of that. Too many other wrong priorities on my mind at the time. So I knelt down on the cement right there in front of the jet, and Father John gave me a blessing. And I went over, did the pre-flight of the airplane, and as I'm getting ready to climb up the ladder, I noticed all these guys running, coming out of the darkness who had seen this, and all my other pilots are running over to the airplane to get Father John to bless them. So he did. And when everybody came back safe from the first sortie, we kind of decided, that's it. Father John has to bless everybody. Can't change that. And it didn't matter if you were Jewish or Baptist or Islamic. It just didn't matter. Father John gave the blessing for the 4th Fighter Squadron. The amazing thing was it didn't matter whether you flew at 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning, and we flew around the clock. And later on, talking to Tom Rackley, who was commanding the 421st, I found out that Father John did the same for his guys. I don't know how he did it, but he did. And every time I landed from a combat sortie, every single time, my canopy would open, I'd shake the hands of Sergeant Manny Villa, my crew chief, who was the first guy I shook hands with every day. Then I climbed down the ladder, and at the bottom of the ladder was Father John to bless me and welcome me home. Next slide, please. When I came back from Desert Storm, I ended up alone, different story, but I ended up single ship returning to Hill Air Force Base. And when I pulled up into the parking spot here, these are the folks who were waiting out front. And my squadron had been home for 3 days before I got there. Down at the far end, you'll recognize Father John again. That's my wife, Betty, and a couple of my kids and a couple of their friends who were with him. I'd written Betty and told her about Father John and the blessings. You want to know how cool she is? When this airplane stopped and the canopy came up, Manny Villa climbed the ladder and shook my hand. And I walked down to the bottom of the ladder, and Betty told Father John, "You first." Father John walked over and blessed me and welcomed me home. And then Betty and I did some serious groping. Next slide, Fred. No, leave it there. A year and a half later, Father John Pearson dropped dead of a massive heart attack. Great story, huh? Too much whiskey, too many cigars, too many parties, I guess. A week after he died, 16 of the 28 pilots who flew in my squadron in Desert Storm were at his funeral in Stockton, California. They came from Korea, they came from Europe, they came from Australia, they came from all over the United States to tell his family about Father John and to bless him and ask God to welcome him home. I'll never forget Father John Pearson. Next slide, Fred. This is a place called Al Ramaya Barracks in northwestern Iraq. These are ammunition storage bunkers. They aren't real significant, except there's a guy I want to tell you about who had something to do with the holes in them. His name is Ed, USAFA Class 86. Ed left for the desert with his wife Jill, pregnant with her first child. This was a story repeated throughout Desert Storm and all the services and throughout history of the military. Obviously, he couldn't go home for the birth. About 2 in the morning one night, I got a woken up in my hooch by my exec who said, you got to call at the command post, which was about 10 minutes away. So I get dressed and go sprinting to the command post, and it's my wife. And she says, Mark, I'm at Humana Hospital in Ogden, Utah, and Jill Rinke is in labor, and she's having problems. Is there any way we can get Ed on the phone with her? So we went and rousted Ed, brought him down to the command center, and my wife had worked out some arrangement with the hospital where Ed walked in, sat down, I handed him a phone, and he's talking to Jill, who's in the middle of a really bad labor. As he held the phone with one hand and talked to his wife, I sat in front of him on a chair, and I held his other hand for about 2.5 hours, which is something neither of us have ever admitted publicly before. And I could see the happiness in his eyes every time she talked back to him and said anything. And I could see the worry and the pain in his eyes every time another contraction started and he heard her flinch or gasp or scream. And I felt him squeeze my hands every time he could tell she was really in pain. And I saw him smile when he heard his son Nate cry for the first time from 9,000 miles away. Next slide, Fred. This is Ed when he came home and met his 6-month-old son, Nate. I'll never forget Nate. "12 hours after Ed hung up that phone, he was the cell leader for a 12 ship of F-16s that hit those bunkers at RMI barracks. It was the best battle damage assessment we had in our squadron during the war. They hit every target, and a lot of them, as you saw from that photo, dang near dead center. Ed went from caring, concerned, loving father and husband to cold-blooded, calculated killing machine in 12 hours. Only in combat, folks. I'll never forget watching the transformation." Next slide, Fred. Next slide, Fred. One of the most important things about combat is sound. Anybody who's been there will tell you that things you hear are the things you remember the longest. And I want to tell you about 2 things I heard that I'll never forget. The first one was during one of our missions up north in the Baghdad area. A pilot in an F-16 from another unit, who was part of the strike package we were in, was hit by a surface-to-air missile. And over the strike common frequency, because one of his radios, electrical system was damaged, he could only talk on the radio with the strike frequency. And he couldn't change off that frequency for some reason. We listened to he and his flight lead talk about his airplane falling apart as he tried to make it to the border so rescue could get to him. And he'd come on every now and then and talk about the oil pressure was dropping and vibrations were increasing, and his flight lead would encourage him to stick with it. We can get there, we can get there. This went on for about 14 or 15 minutes. Until finally he said, oil pressure just went to 0. And then my engine quit. And then that's all I got. I'm out of here. Now, we couldn't see them. I'm not sure exactly where they were. But there wasn't another sound on that radio for that 14 or 15 minutes. And then there was kind of a pregnant pause. And then the last call we heard was, "Tell my wife I love her." I'll never forget those 14 minutes. The other thing I heard was when the ground war actually started, and an F-16